Clara Dawson had been warned about Montana winters before she ever stepped off the dusty stagecoach. Every man in the crowded depot had said the same thing in their own blunt frontier way. The cold test you. The wind'll judge you. The storms don't ask permission. But none of those warnings prepared her for the night. The sky itself seemed to split open. Clara's small cabin sat at the edge of town, a mile from the nearest neighbor and half a world away from the brick row houses of Boston. She had taken the teaching job because she wanted purpose, wanted to matter somewhere, not just vanish in a crowd. Yet here, in a land wide enough to swallow whole states, loneliness crept into even the bravest heart. That evening, the snow began as a whisper, soft, harmless, the kind that dusted the windowsill like powdered sugar. Clara almost found it charming. She set her kettle to boil, took out her journal, and wrote a few lines about frontier sunsets and the way the mountains looked like sleeping giants. But frontier nights change fast. Within an hour, the wind rose like a living thing. It didn't howl, it screamed. The shutters rattled, slamming against the frame with a violence that made her flinch. Snow whipped sideways across the windows, thick and wild, as though someone had torn a feather mattress open in the heavens. Clara hurried to secure the shutters, but the wind fought her at every hinge. Her lantern kept flickering, shadows jerking across the log walls. "You can do this," she told herself. "You're strong enough, Dot, but even strength needs shelter." And the shelter she had was losing the fight. A sickening crack echoed above her. At first, she thought it was thunder. Then another crack, closer, heavy like a giant stepping on rotten wood. Clara looked up, just as a roof beam sagged under the weight of accumulating snow. Splinters rained down. Cold air plunged through the widening gap. "Oh no. No, please hold," she whispered. The beam groaned again. She stumbled backward, knocking over her chair. Her lantern wobbled, barely staying upright. Panic surged hot in her chest. If the roof collapsed, she'd be buried or frozen before help could even hear her cries. She grabbed her coat, her boots, her lantern. She didn't know where she'd go in a storm like this. But anywhere was safer than staying under a dying roof. And then a heavy fist thudded against the door. Once, twice. Then a deeper voice through the roar of the storm. "Miss Dawson? You inside?" Clara froze. She knew that voice, though she had spoken to him only twice in town. Taza, the Apache scout who'd helped track a missing rancher's cattle earlier that morning. Words about him floated through the town all the time, some respectful, some suspicious, most undeserving. But Clara had noticed things others ignored: the patience in his eyes, the quiet way he observed the world, the way he treated strangers with a calm steadiness that felt like a warm fire in a cold room. She hesitated only a moment before pulling open the door. The wind shoved it wide, nearly tearing it from her hands. Taza stepped inside like a wall of warmth and snow-dusted strength. His long coat was crusted white at the shoulders, hair dark with melted flakes. He scanned the room once, saw the sagging beam, and moved with fast, decisive purpose. "Your roof won't hold," he said over the storm's roar. "You need to leave. Right now." Clara could barely hear herself think. I was just about to." The beam above them let out a gut-deep crack. Taza seized her arm, not rough, not commanding, but firmly protective, and pulled her away just as the beam splintered and crashed onto the spot where she had been standing. Snow exploded inward. The lantern almost went out. "You can't stay here," he said, steady even as the storm shook the walls. "It's not safe." Fear made her knees weak, but something else steadied her: his presence, his certainty. The realization that he had walked through the blizzard for no other reason than concern for her. "Come," he said. "My cabin is close. You'll make it." And though she didn't know the land, didn't fully know him, Clara found herself nodding Dot because sometimes survival in the West wasn't about how strong you were, Dot. It was about who showed up when the storm came. The moment Clara stepped outside, the storm swallowed her whole. The cold wasn't just cold, it was a force, a bite, the kind that wrapped around her ribs and squeezed. Wind hurled snow sideways so fiercely it felt like walking through a white wall. Taza kept one steadying hand at her back, guiding her through the blinding chaos. His movements were sure, practiced, like a man who'd learned the land not through books or town talk, but through years of watching how clouds built, how winds twisted, how storms breathed. "Stay close," he said, voice steady against the roaring wind. "Don't lose your footing." Clara tried to answer, but her words were ripped away by the storm. Her hair whipped across her face. She stumbled once, twice, and each time Taza caught her before she fell. His hands strong and warm even through the thick leather of his gloves. Her entire cabin seemed to groan behind them. Another beam snapping as if pushing them out before the roof gave in completely. Clara didn't look back. She couldn't. The sting of snow on her cheeks made her eyes water, and fear had her heart pounding too hard to risk a glance. The trek to Taza's cabin should have been short. In the daylight, Clara could have walked it alone with no trouble. But at night, in a whiteout, the world shrank to the circle of faint lantern light and the tall silhouette of the man leading her. She clung to that silhouette the way she clung to hope. When they finally reached his cabin, she almost didn't see it. The storm nearly buried it beneath drifting snow, the wind pressing against its walls like a battering ram. Yet the structure stood firm, logs thick, joints tight. Snow shelter built with knowledge passed down long before settlers arrived. Taza pushed open the door and ushered her inside. Warmth hit her instantly, wood stove heat, thick and comforting. The air smelled of cedar and dried sage. Clara breathed out shakily, removing her snow-covered shawl with trembling fingers. "You're freezing," Taza said, shutting the door hard against the wind. Clara didn't deny it. Her teeth were chattering so badly she couldn't form the words. Taza crossed the room, grabbed one of the heavy quilts folded on a chest, and wrapped it around her shoulders with a gentleness that surprised her. The fabric was thick, hand-stitched, patterned with geometric designs that seemed to glow in the lamplight. "You'll warm up," he said. "Storms can frighten anyone who's not used to them." Clara blushed, embarrassed. I've never been in one this fierce." Taza lifted an eyebrow, his expression calm, not judging. "The land is teaching you," he said. "Winter speaks loudly here." Before she could reply, another deafening crack sounded, this one far away. Clara flinched, instinctively stepping back. The quilt slipped slightly, and Taza reached out as if to steady her, but stopped, giving her space. "You're safe here," he said. "Nothing's falling on you now." Yet her heart still hammered, faster and faster, as if it hadn't gotten the message. Seeing her trembling, Taza guided her toward his bed, not to lie down, but to sit where the quilt could wrap fully around her and the warmth from the stove could reach her face. The bed was covered in another handmade quilt, this one deep blue and red, colors glowing in the lamplight. When she sat, she realized her legs were still shaking. Taza crouched beside her, his tall frame lowering until his eyes were level with hers. He didn't touch her, didn't crowd her, but he positioned himself close enough to block the draft coming from the door. "Look at me, Clara." She met his eyes because something in his voice left no room for fear, only steadiness. "Keep your eyes on mine." Soft, steady, grounding. Her breathing slowed. Her shaking eased. The storm outside still raged, but inside the cabin, another kind of storm fear. Panic began to quiet. This was a different kind of closeness than she'd ever known. Not the kind meant to fluster or fluster her. This was survival closeness. Human closeness. The kind that said, "I'm here. You're not alone." Taza studied her face, making sure she was steady, then rose to his full height. "I'll make a fire hotter," he said. "You rest. You crossed a storm tonight most folks here wouldn't brave." A small smile found her lips. "Only because you came," she whispered. Taza paused at the stove, hands resting on the iron edge. For the briefest moment, she saw warmth in his expression that had nothing to do with the fire. "You were worth helping," he said simply. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Montana, Clara felt the ground beneath her feet, not the land itself, but the understanding that she had just taken her first true step into a place where courage wasn't something you found alone. Someone had shown her the way. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and warmth, a world apart from the storm that raged outside. Clara sank into the quilt Taza had placed over her shoulders, letting the heavy fabric envelope her like a protective shell. For a moment, the only sounds were the fire crackling in the stove and the wind whistling through the cracks of his sturdy cabin walls. Yet, Clara's heart hadn't calmed completely. The snowstorm, the collapsing beam, and the near miss at her own cabin had left a tremor in her chest. Her hands, still slightly shaking from the cold and fear, gripped the quilt tightly. Every nerve seemed to hum with adrenaline. Taza watched her carefully, his tall figure standing near the bed. He noticed the way her eyes darted toward the window, then back toward him, as though seeking assurance. He knew the fear she felt was natural. Any newcomer to the West, especially someone untested in Montana's harsh winters, would feel the same. He had seen many brave souls falter in the face of storms, not just of wind and snow, but of isolation and uncertainty. "Clara," he said softly, "sit here." He gestured to the edge of the bed. "Sit where the quilt will keep you warm. Stay close to the fire. You're safe now." She hesitated. The bed seemed intimate, unfamiliar. She wasn't used to having anyone this close, let alone a man whose strength and reputation could make lesser hearts falter. But there was something in Taza's calm demeanor that made the fear less pressing, a certainty that reassured her more than any wall or lock ever could. Taza moved to stand beside her. "Sit, trust me," he said. His voice was firm but not commanding, a rare balance between authority and care. It was the voice of a man who understood both the land and its people, and now the vulnerability of someone brave enough to step into it. Clara obeyed, sinking onto the quilted bed. Taza remained near, his tall frame a protective presence, his shadow stretching across the room as if guarding her from the storm's fury. "Look at me," he said gently, not harshly. Clara lifted her eyes. They met his dark, steady, unwavering. His gaze didn't intimidate her. It anchored her. She realized in that moment that trust wasn't just about safety from the storm, it was about connection. About knowing someone would not let you fall. Whether literally or figuratively, "Keep your eyes on mine," Taza added softly. His words were not an order. They were a promise. Clara's breath began to slow. Her muscles relaxed, no longer tense with panic. The warmth of the quilt, the heat of the stove, and the steady presence of Taza created a cocoon of safety. She realized she hadn't felt this kind of calm since leaving Boston, a calm born not of solitude, but of shared strength. The storm outside continued to howl, yet inside the cabin, time seemed to slow. Taza's presence was a lesson in understanding that courage and composure were not only measured by what one could do alone, but by how one could accept help and guidance when it mattered most. Clara began to understand that strength could be gentle, that protection could come in forms that didn't diminish her own agency. After a few moments, Taza crouched slightly, his eyes level with hers. He didn't reach out or touch her, respecting her personal space, yet his presence filled the room. "Winter here teaches harsh lessons," he said. "It's not just about surviving the storm, but about learning how to face it without fear. You've already taken the first step, by being brave enough to trust someone who knows the land. Clara felt a warmth beyond the fire. His words were more than reassurance, they were an acknowledgment of her courage. And for the first time, she realized that surviving the frontier wasn't merely a physical challenge. It was also a matter of heart and mind. I didn't think I could make it, she admitted quietly. You have, Taza replied, voice firm yet soft. And you'll continue to. You've already learned something essential tonight, how to rely on others without losing yourself. The storm's fury outside seemed smaller now, almost distant. Clara's hands relaxed, the quilt heavy and comforting around her. She realized the cabin, the fire, and Taza's presence had become a sanctuary, a safe space to process the night's chaos. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Clara felt grounded. Not just safe from the storm, but supported, seen, and understood. And in that recognition, the fragile beginnings of trust and perhaps something deeper began to bloom. In the wide, untamed West, storms would always come. But she now understood that facing them with courage, guidance, and connection could turn fear into knowledge, and peril into a lesson for the soul. The storm outside raged on through the night, relentless and unforgiving, yet inside Taza's cabin, a different kind of lesson unfolded. Clara sat by the fire, the quilt still draped over her shoulders, the warmth seeping into her bones. The rhythmic crackle of the wood stove was soothing, and the golden light painted the cabin walls with gentle shadows. Taza moved around the cabin with quiet purpose, stoking the fire, adjusting the logs, and checking the small supplies he kept organized for emergencies. Clara watched him, fascinated. Everything he did had intention, a practiced precision born from years of survival in the wilderness. She realized quickly that surviving in the West wasn't merely about brute strength. It was about knowledge, observation, and patience. He glanced at her, noticing her curiosity. You want to know how to survive here, he said softly, beyond just staying warm tonight? Clara nodded. She had come to Montana to teach children, but she quickly realized that the land itself could teach as much, if not more, than any classroom. She wanted to learn, not just endure. Taza began with the basics. Watch the wind, he said, moving to a small window where snow swirled like a living veil. It tells you the storm's direction, the snow's weight, where the weak spots and structures are. You can tell a lot by listening and by watching quietly. He handed her a small, smooth piece of pine wood. Feel it. Learn the scent of the pines and the smoke. Smell tells you of fire's strength and when the air is dry or damp. Clara inhaled, recognizing the subtle differences immediately. She had never considered scent a survival tool before, but in Taza's hands it became essential knowledge. Winter is more than cold, he continued. It's a teacher. It teaches patience. It teaches observation. It teaches respect. He paused, letting the words settle between them. You've already shown respect by listening tonight, by trusting when you didn't have all the answers. Clara felt a swell of pride. She had come west believing her education books, letters, and city schooling made her prepared. Yet she now understood that wisdom could take many forms, and courage could exist quietly, in moments of trust and learning. As the fire warmed the room, she shared her own lessons in return. She spoke of the children she taught back in Boston, of reading and arithmetic, of patience and discipline. She explained how teaching wasn't just about giving knowledge, but about helping others find confidence in themselves. Taza listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking a question that made her think deeper. It was the first real connection Clara had felt in Montana, an exchange of worlds, both valuable, both new to the other. Taza taught her the land, the storms, and survival. Clara taught him the mind, education, and patience in a different sense. Together, they formed a balance. Hours passed, the storm relentless outside, yet the cabin felt like a world apart. Each lesson deepened Clara's understanding of the frontier, not just as a dangerous place, but as a space where knowledge, respect, and courage intertwined. And each time she spoke, Taza's gaze held a subtle warmth, an acknowledgement not just of her mind, but of her spirit. When the fire died down to embers, Taza brought her a small cup of tea, brewed strong and fragrant. "Drink," he said. "The body and mind need fuel to learn." She sipped gratefully, letting the warmth spread through her as she reflected on the evening dot in that quiet, storm-tossed cabin. Clara realized something essential. Survival in the West wasn't merely about enduring hardship, it was about learning from it, growing from it, and connecting with others who understood the land and the people. The night became a lesson in two worlds. One, understanding the frontier's harshness and the classroom structure, the wisdom of experience and the knowledge of books. They met here in a small cabin around a fire, under a storm-tossed sky, and though neither spoke of it directly, both recognized that trust, respect, and shared knowledge were the foundation not only of survival, but of something far more enduring, a bond that could grow into partnership, perhaps even love. By the time the storm finally began to soften outside, Clara felt transformed. She had survived more than just the night. She had learned, and in learning, she had begun to see that courage could take many forms, sometimes in action, sometimes in observation, and sometimes in simply allowing oneself to trust another human being. By the next morning, the storm had finally spent its fury. Snow blanketed the Montana frontier in brilliant white, and the sun's early rays sparkled across the drifts, making the land look almost magical. Clara and Taza walked back toward her cabin, where the damage from the storm was clear: a collapsed roof beam, scattered snow, and frozen water dripping from the edges. The townsfolk were already stirring. Word had traveled fast, as it always did in a small frontier town. Whispers followed them down the snow-packed road, carrying suspicion, curiosity, and some would admit, if reluctantly, admiration. "Look at her," muttered one woman, and with Taza no less. "What do you suppose happened?" "An accident," another replied, lowering her voice. "But, you know, people will talk." Clara felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the unease that often accompanied being the center of attention. She knew what they were thinking: a young, unaccompanied woman taken in by an Apache scout. Gossip was inevitable, and in a town built on caution and tradition, whispers could become judgments in moments. Taza, sensing her hesitation, stayed close but allowed her to take the lead. "It doesn't matter what they think," he said quietly. "What matters is that you survived and that we both know the truth of what happened." Clara took a deep breath, letting his confidence bolster her own. She knew he was right. The opinions of others were fleeting. Her actions were enduring. As they reached her cabin, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors craned their necks, eyes wide with curiosity. Some hid shock behind polite nods, while others whispered to one another with barely concealed judgment. Clara squared her shoulders. The lessons of the night before, the trust, courage, and wisdom she had absorbed from Taza, were still vivid. She would not shrink from confrontation, for the West did not reward fear. "My cabin was damaged in the storm," she began, her voice calm but carrying through the crisp air. "I could have been trapped or hurt. Taza helped me. He ensured I was safe. That is the truth, and nothing else matters." The crowd paused, murmurs spreading. A few faces flushed with embarrassment at being caught so flagrantly curious. Taza stood quietly beside her, silent and strong, his eyes respectful and unyielding. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough to reinforce Clara's words. "I expect respect," she continued, her tone measured but firm. And in this town, we survive by helping one another. That includes strangers, neighbors, and friends alike. Gossip should not outweigh human decency. There was silence. Even the harshest critic seemed to reconsider. Clara's courage, the kind that had faced storms, snow, and near disaster, carried more weight than idle whispers. A few townsfolk stepped forward, helping her survey the damage to the cabin. Others brought tools or blankets, quietly showing support without speaking. Clara realized that leadership on the frontier didn't always come with a title. It often came from action, courage, and moral clarity. She glanced at Taza. He nodded slightly, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. In that look, she understood that he was proud not for himself, but for her. She had stood firmly, spoken boldly, and claimed her voice. The frontier had tested her once again, and she had answered that by mid-morning. Clara had regained control of her homestead. Repairs would take time, but she no longer feared the storm or the town's opinion. She had learned an invaluable lesson. Survival was as much about moral courage and self-respect as it was about physical endurance. And as she turned to Taza, the sun catching the frost in his dark hair, Clara felt a quiet, growing warmth in her chest. Beyond survival, beyond the lessons and the storm, there was something else, a bond, forged in fire and snow, built on trust, understanding, and shared experience. It was the kind of bond the frontier demanded, strong, steady, and enduring. And perhaps, she thought, it might last far longer than any storm. Clara Dawson had survived the storm, faced the town, and taken her first step toward carving a life in the West that was truly her own, wise, courageous, and most importantly, hers. The snow had finally stopped, leaving a sparkling blanket over the Montana frontier. The sun reflected off the drifts like 1,000 diamonds, casting light on Clara's damaged cabin. Where the storm had destroyed, the community now saw an opportunity not just to rebuild, but to strengthen bonds forged in adversity. Clara stood beside Taza as the townsfolk arrived, carrying tools, timber, and blankets. Neighbors she had barely spoken to before now offered warm smiles, nods of respect, and hands ready to help. Even those who had whispered the loudest the day before seemed eager to show they were on her side. "Looks like we've got our work cut out for us," one burly rancher said, hefting a bundle of planks over his shoulder. Clara laughed, a sound full of relief and renewed energy. "I'm grateful for every hand," she replied. "It's a lot easier to face the frontier with friends." Taza moved beside her, carrying heavy beams with ease, his presence commanding respect without a word. Clara watched him, admiring not just his strength, but his patience and knowledge. He guided the townsfolk on proper support placement and structural reinforcement, teaching as he worked, explaining how certain joints would resist snow weight, how angled beams offered more protection than straight ones, and why proper chinking kept out drafts. "You see," he said to Clara as he checked a corner joint, "surviving the land is as much about preparation and knowledge as it is about strength. You learned that during the storm. Now we apply it to rebuild." Clara nodded, realizing the night's lessons weren't over. Education here wasn't limited to books or classrooms. It came from life, experience, and the guidance of someone who knew the land intimately. She felt herself grow not just in courage, but in understanding. The work continued throughout the day. Clara found herself measuring, lifting small planks, and helping secure the roof while Taza directed and instructed. Their hands brushed occasionally, and each time a warmth traveled up her arm, a subtle acknowledgement that this partnership went beyond survival. Trust had transformed into companionship. By late afternoon, the cabin stood sturdier than ever. Its walls, repaired and reinforced, bore witness to collaboration and knowledge applied. The roof had been strengthened with Taza's careful planning, and the interior once again offered a safe, warm sanctuary. Snow still rested in the corners, but the danger had passed. Clara paused at the doorway, surveying the work, and allowed herself a deep breath. "It's perfect," she said, voice filled with satisfaction and gratitude. Taza approached, his boots crunching softly in the snow. He looked at the cabin, then at her. "Not perfect because of the boards or the beams," he said, "but because of how you face the storm and because of how you face the town. Courage and respect go farther than any tools." Clara smiled, feeling warmth beyond the fire or quilt from days before. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. "You wouldn't have needed me," he said, with a quiet confidence, "if not for the trust you placed in someone else. That's the difference between surviving and thriving here. You learned well." For a long moment they stood together, the sun casting golden light across their faces. Clara realized that this wasn't just survival. It was a beginning of partnership built on respect, courage, and shared experience. The storm had tested her, the town had tested her, and she had emerged not only unbroken but stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace life in the West. Finally, Taza offered his hand, extended in friendship, respect, and something more unspoken. Clara took it, warmth meeting warmth, their fingers intertwining naturally. The frontier around them was wide, wild, and uncertain, but together they felt anchored. As the townsfolk began to leave, some lingering to exchange a few friendly words, Clara felt a new sense of belonging. She had a home, allies, and now a bond with someone who understood her world and her heart. That evening, with the repaired cabin glowing from the stove's fire, Clara and Taza sat side by side, sharing quiet conversation and planning for the months ahead. They spoke of survival, of teaching, of the land's lessons, and of mutual respect. And beneath it all, a deeper connection blossomed, born of shared trials and trust earned. The frontier was still vast and unpredictable, but Clara Dawson and Taza now faced it together. Two worlds had met, city and plains, knowledge and experience, courage and wisdom, and had found harmony in the heart of the Montana wilderness. In the West, storms would always come, but Clara had learned how to face them, with knowledge, with courage, and with someone to stand beside her. And that, she realized, was the truest kind of strength. A new beginning, strong and lasting, had been built just like her cabin,